Holdfast, a war game by Worthington Games, a game that covers Barbarossa, the Barbarossa campaign in 1941-1942. One of the most gamed subject in wargaming, and a subject that usually lends itself to massive maps, hundreds, if not thousands of counters, monster games with monster rulebooks. Here, the entire affair is resolved on a map which does not have many hexes. As you can see, this is the full map. Well, you'll see it better later. There aren't many units in the game. This is a block war game, and the entire German units are probably 20. There are probably like 20, a little over 20 German units, a little bit more for the Soviets. Rulebook, I believe 6 pages, but no more than 3 of those pages are actual rules. Everything else is introduction, designer's notes, the cover. 3 pages of rules, a small map, small unit count for the largest military campaign of history. Is this madness? Were the designers out of their mind? Is this too ambitious? Well, I have an answer to all of these questions, but before I get to that answer, I want to show you the game a little more in detail. I want to teach you about the main mechanics and ideas behind the design, and then I'll share my opinions about Holdfast, Russia 1941-1942. The game is played on this map, which is made of cardstock, thick paper. It lays flat on the table very easily without needing a piece of plexiglass. There's no plexiglass on it right now, and it just works well. Very simple. The art is pretty basic, but definitely it is very functional. At the beginning of the game, as you can imagine, German and German allied units set up in this area, ready to invade, and then there will be a front of Soviet units ready to defend, and in many cases ready to be completely annihilated by the German advance. Other Soviet units will be defending in the mainland. At the beginning of each turn, you have a resource phase where players determine the resource points that they receive for that turn. The German player receives a default number of 16 resource points throughout the game per turn, and the Russian player receives 16 points per turn in 1941 and then 18 per turn in 1942. These points, however, can be affected by weather. Weather may reduce the number of resource points that the players receive. Also, if the German player occupies cities with a star in Soviet territory, the Russian player loses resource points. Once you have the number of resource points that the players receive each turn, you place the marker for each player on that track, which, interesting enough, is printed on the back of the box. Unusual, but not unwelcome. No problem with that. Then resource points are used during the game for anything. Anything you need to do, you simply move the marker on the board. In many cases, you'll be keeping a finger there. With one hand, you move things around, and with one hand, you move the marker on the board, on that board, to indicate the expenditure of resource points. After the resource point phase, you have the weather phase. You need to determine the weather. You look at the turn track. In many turns, the weather is fixed. For example, in June, July, August, and September 1941, the weather is always clear, no particular effects. In other turns, the weather is fixed too, but it's a different weather. For example, in February 1942, it is always snow. But there are turns in which you have a mini weather table printed on the turn track itself. You roll a die and determine the weather for the turn. For example, October 1941, you roll 1d6. 1 to 3, the weather is still clear. 4 to 6, the weather is mud. November 1941, you roll a d6. 1, 2, clear. 3, 4, mud. 5, 6, snow. So there is a lot of variety here from game to game because of the changing weather. Clear weather, as I said, no particular effects. Mud weather is super punitive. Both players lose resource points, the German player more than the Russian player. German air units are not available, and all units have their movement allowance reduced by half, which is terrible. Snow, no German air units, all movement allowances are reduced by 1 point, and only the German player loses resource points. Then you have the German player turn and the Russian player turn. Each player turn is divided in 3 phases. First, the active player, always the German first, receives replacements and reinforcements. Then the active player activates units on the board, and then the active player checks for supplies and units that are unsupplied are eliminated. So first we have the German replacement and reinforcement phase, in which the German player spends point to strengthen units that have been reduced on the board, or to bring back to the board units that have been eliminated. Units in this game are represented by blocks, which during gameplay will be standing on the board facing the owning player, so that the opponent doesn't know exactly what unit is behind each block. And the block has a number of strength points that will be reduced when the unit takes a hit, and you reduce those points simply by rotating the block. When the unit receives a replacement, then you rotate the block back to record the number of strength points that the unit has recovered. It costs more points to recover strength points for infantry than it takes to recover points for tanks. And tanks are represented by units such as this one, by blocks of that kind. As I said, if you spend points to replace strength points on the unit, and you simply rotate the unit, a unit that is in an enemy zone of control can only recover a single strength point per turn, no matter how many replacement points you want to spend. A unit that is not an enemy zone of control can recover indefinitely as many points as you have, and it needs to go back to its maximum. Units that have been completely eliminated can be brought back, but the first step of the unit is more expensive. If a unit of the enemy is reduced, it can be a good idea to concentrate strengths, to concentrate attacks against that unit to eliminate it, because to bring it back will take a bigger toll on the opponent than it would take to simply replenish the points that you may have inflicted on the opponent earlier. So the active player brings back units, reinforces units, spending resource points. And this is great because you have to figure out how many you want to spend, because those resource points you will also need to activate units on the board. You made your army as good as new by spending a ton of resource points on replacements and reinforcements. Hooray for you, but your army is a big sitting duck because you don't have resource points to perform actions. After replacements and reinforcements, yes, you activate units. It takes a resource point to activate a single unit for movement. You spend the resource point, and then the unit moves on the board, spending movement points. The movement points available for each unit are presented on this very functional player aid. Unit moves, movement points will be affected by terrain. Different types of terrain have different costs, but there aren't many types of terrain, therefore not many costs that you have to keep in mind. Spend a resource point, move the unit up to its full movement allowance, or reduce movement allowance if weather rules are in play. Also, enemies also control will affect the movement, will make movement more expensive. Units usually project a zone of control in the 6 axes surrounding them. So each unit that you move will cost a single resource point. Attacks can be less expensive because you can combine attacks. It takes a single resource point to declare an attack against an enemy hex. And then once you spend the point pretty much in that hex or for that hex, you can use as many of your adjacent units as you want to attack. That is, with a single resource point, you could use 3 units to attack that unit there. Also, stacking limit is pretty simple, 1 block per space. When combat is declared, you reveal the blocks, and then you roll dice. Now, this is pretty important. In many block games, the number of dice that you roll when you attack is equal to the strength points of the unit. Not here. The dice rolled in combat are detached from the strength of the unit. They are determined by this chart here. German infantry always rolls 3 dice, German allied infantry 2 dice, German armor 4, Russian armor 4 as well. Air units, only the German player has air units, they can be spent in combat and they add 2 dice to combat. Russian infantry rolls a number of dice equal to the unit's maximum strength. So for example, this unit when it enters the board, the strength of 2, that's the maximum strength, will roll 2 dice in combat, even if reduced. This unit always rolls 3 dice in combat because that is the maximum amount of points. So this is a thing that I haven't seen in other block games, or not in many at least, that the number of dice rolled is unrelated to the number of strength points that the unit has. To hit an opponent, you look at this target hit numbers, you need to match the target hit of the unit that you're targeting to match it or to exceed it. In other words, to hit infantry you need to roll 5 or more, that means 5 or 6. To hit armor you need 6. It is that simple. 5 or 6 against infantry, 6 against armor. The unit that is rolling the dice is not important. It doesn't matter which unit is attacking. It's still 5 or 6 against infantry, 6 against armor. So you activate your units to move for regular movement, railroad movement, combat. Each hit that you inflict in combat, of course, reduces the enemy by 1 step. And once you're done with your turn, with your resource points, you check for supplies. Now you check if a unit is supplied when you're moving it, because there's a penalty to move a unit that is unsupplied, and then you check your supply again for all units on the board at the end of the turn, because units that are unsupplied at the end of the turn are eliminated. So trying to cut enemy supply lines and preserving your own supply lines is really key in this game. To be in supply, a German unit needs to be within 5 hexes from the western edge of the board, or 5 hexes from a German-controlled city. As you move along the board, you will take control of other cities, which can then become supply points, or 5 hexes from the Finnish border. However, if you're supplying from a control city, that city in turn is to be within 5 edges to another control city all the way back to the western edge. So if you have a unit here which supplies from here, but the city is completely surrounded, that is not a good supply point. You need to be able to trace a chain of cities. Victory is determined at the end of the game, at the end of the January 1943 turn. The player who wins is simply the player that controls at least 2 key Soviet cities: Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad. The player who controls at least 2 of these cities is the winner. As simple as that. After reading the rules and looking at the components, I thought, well, this is gonna be a semi-abstract block game with a thinly pasted on theme. I mean, how can this be Barbarossa campaign, right? And here's the magic of the thing. It is. This game is disproportionately thematic and disproportionately right. It feels right. It feels like you're playing a game about the Barbarossa campaign and not about something else, which is nothing short of a miracle when you see the economic engine that you have behind it. I feel like the designer started from a pile of rule books of other games about Barbarossa campaign, and they just distilled and kept reducing things until they got to a point where if you take one more thing out, the entire thing falls apart. But as is, it stands. There's a lot that have been abstracted into the design, a lot that has been hardwired, and yet it is there. Things have been clearly designed for effect, but again, the effect is precisely that you are playing a game that feels right, that captures the general swing and feel of the event, the general progression. You have the initial German push with the Soviet units that just disintegrate, but they can be brought back easily. So the two sides do play very differently. The German player pushes and pushes and pushes. The Soviet player keeps getting bashed and getting back and getting back on his feet, getting bashed again, back on his feet, until the people that start moving from the eastern side are not just the people that have been rebuilt, but new people and bigger people and stronger people and people driving tanks. And very gradually, very slowly, the pace and the tempo of the game changes, and the German all of a sudden hits a wall. And I like how that doesn't happen as suddenly as I described it here. It's more like at a certain point you realize as the German player that you hit the wall maybe a month ago, but only now it starts hurting. The gradual strengthening of the Russian side is handled very well, to the point that indeed you do not necessarily realize it that it's happening, but just a point you're like, wait a moment, where all these units come from, and why all of a sudden my tanks are hitting other tanks and getting hit in return. It's all there with very small rules, with very simple details, a little bit of chrome added to the basic rules that I explained to you. For example, the first time that there's a snow turn, the Russian player receives a ton of extra resource points. The first clear weather turn of 1942, the German player receives a lot of extra resource points to simulate the spring advance. You have the main phases of 1941, 1942. You have the main events. When the mud hits, then things get terrible. Units start being unable to move around. The pace is very slow. Then you can use those turns to reorganize your army. Then the snow makes things a little better, but not necessarily. Then you have the big advance of 1942. And then you have the final phase of the game in which the German player needs to grab the final objectives. And the decisions that the German player is faced with feel very historical and definitely are very tense and tough. You have to choose which are the objectives that you're going to try to achieve. I think it's very hard. It's going to be very hard for the German player to capture all three objectives. You have to concentrate on the two that you need to win the game. Are you going to push towards the north, Moscow and Leningrad, or it's going to be towards the south, Moscow and Stalingrad? Are you going to be brave and split your forces around Moscow, maybe opening yourself to the possibility of an attack that will split your army in two? The possibility of pocketing enemy units is definitely there, and you have moments of the desperate defense as units that are going to be pocketed will fight to come out. You have all of these events, all of these dilemmas, all of these elements that belong to history and belong to much bigger designs that all of a sudden coalesce here in something that gives you an historical feel, gives you the challenges that historical commanders faced, all in an incredibly economic, minimal package. I cannot think of another game that achieves so much about this topic starting from so little. There are games that are deeper, there are games that are more epic, but there's also a huge investment of time and energy that you have to put in order to experience that. And you have even simpler games than this one about Barbarossa, such as Barbarossa Solitaire. It's a print and play game which is extremely basic, more than this one. But this one has an astounding balance, an astounding ratio between the rules, which are so economic, so few and so straightforward, and the amount of fun, the amount of detail, the amount of chrome, the amount of historical feel that somehow miraculously explodes out of this box. Holdfast, Russia, 1941-1942. It surprised me from the beginning to the end. It told me the story that the box promises is in this game. It told me the story of Barbarossa campaign 1941-1942. It told it to me in a format that I can easily teach to other players. I can play this easily in an evening. 3 hours is a very acceptable It's a very normal, very realistic playtime, probably even less. It even plays well solitaire, which is something unusual with block games, but here if you play by yourself with all the blocks face up, the game still works. You don't lose all that much. You lose a little bit of fog of war, but the game is still perfectly playable and enjoyable. I can't think of a bad thing to say about this game. This is a great product, absolutely a great game. All my admiration goes to this game, a game that I'm definitely very happy to have added to my collection. Hallfest, Russia, 1941-1942, quite an achievement in wargaming by Worthington Publishing.